Well, can I say, first of all, welcome. And it's very good to see lots of faces and also lots of names for people who have not revealed themselves in their living presence. It's very good to have so many on this nice spring evening. And we're delighted and honored to have Ron to give us his talk, and Robert will introduce him shortly. And we will then, at the end, there will be a chance for questions and answers, and Robert will handle that when we get to that point. So I will just say thank you for all for coming. Very good to see you. And I will hand over to Robert to introduce Ron. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be introducing my old friend and sometime field colleague, Ron Summers, as the speaker for tonight's talk. After undertaking a PhD at Aberdeen University on fish ecology, Ron has devoted most of the rest of his career to the study of a diverse array of birds, though he's perhaps best known for his research on wading birds and on uncommon and characteristic breeding birds in Scotland, notably those of the Caledonian pine forest, on which he published a monograph in 2018. Although based in Scotland with the RSPB for many years now, Ron's research on waders and geese in particular has at different times taken him to many parts of the globe, such as Greenland, Siberia, South Africa, and the Falkland Islands. From his time in the last named, he published his first bird monograph, a study of the upland goose and its interactions with man. A concept that Ron has been perhaps particularly associated with is that annual variations in the proportions of young birds in wintering populations of Arctic breeding waders and geese are linked to lemming cycles. In the early 1990s, it became possible for Western biologists to test this directly on the breeding grounds in Siberia, and it was my good fortune to mount a study with Ron, Les Underhill, and Russian colleagues in northern Taimyr, an experience that will always stay with me. Tonight, however, it's Ron's research on the birds and habitat of Scottish pinewoods that we will hear about. Before I hand over to him, could I request that people who wish to ask questions use the chat box function, and we'll then try to pick up on the questions at the end. Many thanks, and over to Ron for his talk on Abernethy Forest, its history and ecology.
Okay, so I guess that's me kicking off now with the title here. And as Robert indicated, I belong to the RSPB Conservation Science Department. I've worked largely on pinewood birds in Abernethy Forest. I've delved in other species as well, but we'll stick with Abernethy Forest and pine forests. So this is a photograph of the upper part of Abernethy Forest as it stretches into the Cairngorm Mountains in the central Highlands of Scotland. It's the second largest RSPB reserve and covers an area of about 125 square kilometres. And these comprise mountains up to Cairngorm, but down through moorlands and pinewoods, which is what I'm going to talk about. The key thing about the forest is it contains more Caledonian pinewood than any other wood in Scotland. This is a key type of woodland, which I'll describe as the talk develops. But the RSPB got involved with this forest largely through the Ospreys when they nested back in the 1950s. And it was only until 1975 they started to acquire parts of Abernethy Forest so that they now own most of it. So the question is, why study the history of a site when you're just dealing with the here and now? Well, apart from it being jolly interesting, it's important to understand why things as they are, particularly with forests, which take so long to develop and grow. So that's why a lot of this talk has been developed around the history of the site before I delve into the wildlife. So a good starting point for any Caledonian woodlands is this book. It's called The Native Pinewoods of Scotland. Unfortunately, that's an unfortunate name because plantations of Scots pine can also be regarded as native pinewoods. But effectively, this book is about the Caledonian pinewoods. That's a term I'll use throughout. So there's a couple of quotes from Stephen Carlyle's book. So effectively defines Caledonian pinewoods. These are the lineal descendants from post-glacial times on these sites. In other words, when pines started to establish after the last glaciation, about 10,000 years ago, pinewoods eventually developed on this site and have their descendants are still there. So effectively, they have a history of about 9,000 years on this site. The other key thing about the definition is that they were naturally regenerated from ancestors of like origin. So you've got a succession of trees, one generation after the other, linking back to the initial pines which were established after the last glaciation. And then there's this emotive statement: to stand in them is to feel the past. So just a quick rundown on the differences between Caledonian pinewood and plantations, which is the other major conifer woodland that we have in the UK. So the Caledonian pinewoods are almost entirely composed of Scots pines. There are other conifers like juniper, which are there, and also broadleaf trees, but it's dominated by Scots pine. By contrast, conifers can be a mixture of species, mainly North American species like Sitka spruce, lodgepole pine, and so on. Plantations too are also, they're harvested before they reach the old growth stage, so that you don't get trees, say, over 100 years in plantations. Whereas in Caledonian pinewoods, you can have trees that are 400 years in Abernethy, and in parts of other parts of Scotland, there's some trees over 500 years old. You'll notice too in the picture on the left, there's a large standing dead tree. You can't get large standing dead trees unless you've got large living trees, which again are characteristics of Caledonian pinewoods. You can see too, there's a much more open structure. So you get heather and bilberry growing in the understory, whereas often you only get moss underneath, say, a Sitka spruce plantation. And these differences obviously have clear consequences for wildlife. Okay, the map on the left in green shows the pinewood zone that we would have had if we hadn't lost our Caledonian pinewoods. So that's a sort of reconstruction of where Caledonian pinewood existed in the past, say at the start of the Neolithic, and we would have had something similar if we hadn't lost these pinewoods. The red dots represent the fragments of the Caledonian pinewoods that are left, particularly on the Eastern Highlands. There's this pointer show up on the screen. Yeah, okay. So these are the Caledonian pinewoods in Strathspey with Abernethy. This one here. This is D side here with big ones, and there's a lot of small ones over in the west. So this map on the right here shows a more of a true picture of the areas of and the locations of these Caledonian pinewoods. And you can see that most of them on the west are tiny, hardly visible. Again, these are the Strathspey ones. That's Abernethy Forest there. These are the ones in D side. So just to reinforce how rare Caledonian pinewoods are, so they represent this dark green segment here. So it's about 1% of the woodland in Scotland. The bulk of the woodland is Sitka spruce, half of it, the red stuff here, and these are also introduced conifers. So to give you an idea how small the size of the Caledonian pinewood is, if you imagine an area, a box, say a square, 13 kilometres by 13 kilometres, you could fit them all into that square. So it's a rare habitat. So how do we know that there was Caledonian pinewood elsewhere in Scotland? Here you can see a treeless landscape, and the stumps in the foreground are remains of Scots pines which have been buried in the peats and are now exposed. And these have been dated to many thousands of years ago. You can also get an indication of what's happened over time by taking cores through either peat bogs or lake deposits. So this diagram shows an example from a loch in Abernethy, which has been cored. And by taking slices through the core, you can look at the pollen at different time zones through time. So the axis on the bottom here shows depth. It's effectively the same as time. So it goes from 0, present day, to 500 centimeters, which is roughly 10,000 years ago. So you can see initially, birch came in as a dominant tree species. And then about 9,000 years ago, pine came in and has remained dominant ever since. So throughout the Holocene, which is what we're living in now, the pines have been on this site, Abernethy, for 9,000 years. You can see two alder coming in later, and then heather more recently. A final bit of information showing that this ancient wood existed over time is that around the lochs, around the cairngorms, there are trees lying on the bottom of the lochs. Not RSPB, but St Andrews University have taken an interest in these and pulled them out. There's the guy in the middle is called Rob Wilson. He's a dendrochronologist who's made a particular study of trees, old trees. You can see the landscape here is now treeless, but clearly in the past it had been because there are trees in the bottom of the loch. The oldest tree that he's dated so far is 8,000 years old. So effectively the first pines which were established after the glaciation, they are still there, lying at the bottom of the lochs. The clever thing you can do with these trees is you can take a slice and then look at the ring spaces, the growth rings. Large growth rings, large gaps means there's been a good summer, narrow gaps means a poor summer. So by measuring these different widths across a trunk like this, you build up a barcode of what the conditions were like at that time. And of course, if you get trees at different time periods through time, you can start to build up a barcode across thousands of years. And so you can date these trees. Of course, you can also do it with carbon dating, which is less accurate. But this barcoding allows one to say this tree was, say, 5,000 years old, whatever. Another interesting thing about this tree is that you can see that it's had this part of the cambium was killed, most likely by fire, when that tree was this old. The tree survived and then continued to grow and overlap the lip, overlap the scar effectively to, So it means that if you count back from there, you can date the fire. So we can look at fire history as well as weather over time. So that's the big project that's been done by Rob Wilson. A question mark hangs over, why did some of these Caledonian pinewoods survive? Well, we know from the literature that the aristocracy of the time were keen on hunting. So this is a statue of James IV. He was very keen on hunting, and there's a statue of him in the Eastgate Centre in Inverness holding a hawk, which he was very keen on falconry. So that was one of the reasons why these sites survived. The very first maps that we have, or sketches if you like, date back to the 1500s. And it shows that the landscape was already farmed. It's a well-farmed landscape. These are all farms that are marked here. And lots of these names like Tullach, Rymore, Rhynerich, these are all names that still exist today. This represents the River Spey going north. The map is upside down effectively. And this is the River Nethy here, which disappears, but obviously the artists have some doubt as to where it entered the Spey. But these trees there on either side of the River Nethy here, they represent Abernethy Forest. We know they're pines because there's this term here, fir woods. Fir is the old Scottish name for the Scots pine. So we know these are Scots pine growing along the Nethy back in the 1500s. A little later on, we now have a more recognizable map of the site drawn in the 1700s. At that time, contours weren't invented, but they represented hills in this rather nice artistic way. So you see here, this great block of woodland represents Abernethy Forest between Loch Garten and Loch na Cruach. I mention these because I'm going to show them again later on, but it indicates this swathe of forest existed at that time. This is Caledonian pinewood. There's no planting at this stage. Planting came later. So this represents the old forest. Of course, people owned these woods and exploited them. It was obviously very difficult in these early days for people to do more than just use the woods for local interest. But gradually, with a bit of ingenuity, they tried to make a more of a commercial thing of it. So this guy, who was the owner of Abernethy, the good Sir James Grant, was the laird. Laird just means a big landowner, lived in his big house, and he was keen on improving things both for his people and for himself by making money out of the forest. The big problem was getting the trees out of the forest. So what they did was they built dams across some of the streams. So there's a stream running from here, going through there, and this dam wall was built. The idea was that of course, there'd be a sluice in these days. Water would back up against the dam, and when they needed water to float the timber, the cut timber out of the forest, they would open the sluices, and the trees get washed down the river. Then it would go down the Nethy, down the Spey, and out to the mouth of the river where there were shipyards for building boats or for transport, even taking logs as far as London. This is the map showing the picture I showed previously. So there's the dam wall there, and you can see a depiction of the water that would held back. And this is a lade which is run into it from the River Nethy here to help boost the volume of water, which then would career down here, flushing the logs all the way down the River Nethy. The picture also shows a farm here. It's in Tomach, which you can see there's cultivated lands here. But these farmers living in the forest were at subsistence level. So they didn't really have a big impact on the forest, and the laird obviously made sure that they didn't muck around too much. They didn't have much in the way of livestock, so there probably wasn't much livestock browsing in these days in the 1700s and 1800s. In the 19th century, with the advent of railways coming through the Highlands, quite a lot of rich industrialists and aristocracy took a lot of interest in coming up to the Highlands to shoot wildlife and fish. And this lady, Anne Holt, was she was the sister of a man, a rich industrialist from Liverpool, who bought the rights to hunt wildlife in Abernethy. And while he was away shooting grouse, she did these wonderful oil paint, these watercolors. This mountain is recognizable as Bainach Moor, and this is the River Nethy, and you can see the cut logs in the river ready to be flushed down and out of the forest. So it's nice to have a contemporary picture of what was going on in these days. And here you can see a bit further down the river, this is the River Drui, which also runs into the Spey. The guys here, they manipulate the logs. You see around about the same size as in Anne Holt's painting, as they guide the logs down the rivers. Must have been jolly cold, standing up to their knees in water. This is one of the last floats we know about. Generally, most of it died out because the railways were taking over in terms of transport. Wars didn't have a good effect on forests in Scotland. This is the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, where there's Lochgarten again, and there's Loch na Cruach. So you can see that this area in here, which would have been woodland based on the 1700 maps, had gone. But it was amazing, not long after that, perhaps through natural recovery and also some planting, all this is now woodland and has been since about the 1860s. But this area here clearly has not been touched. And this is the main area for Caledonian pinewood that still remains within Abernethy. You see too the number of floating dams which were used for transporting logs out of the forest. One there, this is a floating dam. These were also floating dams here for transporting timber. As I mentioned earlier, there were small farms operating in the forest. Of course, there's none now left. But this is another painting here of a farm here, thatched roof and with some sheep. There's no cropping around this land, but we know from the census at the time, the people living in this house were weavers and not farmers. So that probably explains the lack of cropping around this farm here. In the background, you can see there's Cairngorm, and there's the Bainach Moor, which was in the earlier painting I showed you. One of the things that the farmers did make use of in the forest was the gathering of fir candles. So if a tree got damaged by fire, as this tree did, the response of the tree is to build up resin within the damaged part of the trunk. People knew about this and would come along with their axes and cut chunks out of it and make what is known as fir candles. Of course, in these days, there was no electricity, and making candles from wax was difficult. So they made these these fir candles from damaged trees. And here you can see on the left here, this is a fir candle. It's just a splint of trunk, which is now burning fiercely because of the resin. This is the wax candle for comparison. And this guy is Stuart Taylor, who's one of the past senior wardens at Abernethy, who's showing off his fir candles so he can read his bird books. I mentioned earlier that the area got opened up with the railways, and a lot of people were keen on hunting and fishing. So Abernethy was left out to people from the south and who built these big lodges throughout the Highlands. So that during the months when they came to shoot wildlife, they had palatial accommodation. This is actually the biggest wooden building in Scotland, called Forest Lodge. It was built in 1886. The building still stands and is used as offices for the RSPB. This gives you an idea of the numbers of birds they shot. So red grouse, mainly targeted, typically getting 1,000 birds in the 1930s and a few hundreds latterly. Black grouse, quite a lot here, again, from the 1910s to 1930s and few latterly. This is quite interesting for the Capercaillie. Capercaillie, as you probably know, went extinct in Scotland about 1780 and was reintroduced in the 1830s. That was done in Perthshire. It took a while for the Capercaillies to spread through the Highland glens. So I suspect the reason why there was none shot here around about 10 was they still had not colonized Abernethy. But when they did, the numbers shot increased. And you can see in the 1930s, they were shooting about 100 a year, which is quite incredible because the population of Abernethy is only about 100 now. Of course, the population of Capercaillies crashed. It crashed during the 1970s, and very few have been shot recently. And of course, it's now a protected species. The forest continued to be exploited through the 20th century. There was mills operating, mainly making fence posts, and pallets was another big thing. And more aggressive forestry techniques were used because they started to do some planting within the forest. You can see plough lines going through the bogs on the left here, and here through a drier hillsides. Now what happened here, you can still see the plough lines, but there's no trees. That's because it was decided to remove the plantation to try and return the woodland more to a natural type of woodland and allow the trees to regenerate back onto site in the same way that has happened here at the bottom of the picture. But we left the legacies of these plough lines that were made back in the 1980s. So this is Abernethy Forest. There's the Loch Garten there, and there's Loch na Crucha there. And you can see there's the bit of I mentioned here that really hasn't been touched at all, ever. The purple bits are plantations with their dates. So mainly through the 1970s, 1950s there, 1930s. All 20th century plantings. And also up here we have clear fells. We're still clear fell in Caledonian pinewood in the 80s. The last one was this one, 1984. So there's quite a patchwork now left, but we still, as I said in the introduction, more Caledonian pinewood exists on the site than anywhere else in Scotland. So the forest's got amazing diversity of wildlife. So to give you an idea, counting up all the species, there's about 3,800 species of plants, fungi, animals living on the site. The main biodiversity was found in the fungi, with 700 species recorded, and beetles, with 900 species. So unless you're a mycologist or entomologist, it's actually not that interesting a site, though you really can't say that as an ornithologist. We do have some really interesting birds still, and one of these is the Capercaillie, which I mentioned has not done well recently. From 1970s, it's reckoned about 90% of the population disappeared, and we now have about 1,000 birds left in the whole of Scotland. They're mainly found in old growth woodland, and here you can see a dropping of a Capercaillie, and you can see the needles in it. This is the main diet, is that they eat the one-year-old needles from the tops of the trees. So they need these large trees to sort of walk around the crowns, taking the pine needles. In the summertime, they make use of bilberry, both the leaves and the berries. And The young specialize on moth caterpillars that feed on bilberry. I keep on wanting to say blaeberry, because that's what we call it. Things have not gone well for Capercaillie, and over the research we've done, we've identified a few reasons why things are not so good. One is the breeding success is poor if you get a lot of rain in the summertime when the chicks are hatched. So here we can see an axis here which is increasing rainfall, and on this axis, the vertical axis, we see for the breeding production, it's the number of chicks per female. This is the line for Abernethy showing that as you get more rainfall in June, then the number of chicks per hen goes down. And this is for another wood showing exactly the same pattern, but this wood, the birds have done slightly better than Abernethy. But nevertheless, once you've got over this sort of amount of rainfall in June, you've virtually got no production. And whoops, this graph here on the right shows what's happened to June rainfall over the 20th century. And as you can eyeball this, you can see that it's getting wetter. So you can put this down to climate change and affecting the demise of the Capercaillies. Another change is that the pine marten, which almost became extinct within Scotland, has recovered remarkably. It was protected from 1980, and it spread back from northwest Scotland across Scotland, so it's now quite common in Abernethy. We put cameras at Capercaillie nests. It's take a long time to find each nest, but with small cameras that nest on continuous running video, we found out that pine martens were taking a third of the clutches. So given that they were finding these, they probably also found quite a lot of broods as well. And so it meant that the breeding success has probably not been as good since we've had the pine martens return to the forest. The other thing that has affected Capercaillies has been the construction of deer fences. These are about 2 meters high and made with high tensile steel and set against woodland, actually quite hard to see. So when RSPB obtained Abernethy Forest, it was quite quickly we found out that it was birds dying against these fences. It was around about 1 Capercaillie every month for every 4 kilometers of internal deer fence. So the solution was simple, to just make them more visible. And you can see the picture on the left, these additional spars made on the tops of the fences to make them more visible to birds. And that's proved successful. The picture on the right shows what's happened to the population, at least over this time. The black spots represent the actual counts made on transects. The open squares is a modelling of the population based on survival and production. And you can see that the model accounts fairly neatly for the actual numbers. So it means that we've modelled the population fairly successfully. And the triangles here represent what would happen if the additional mortality due to fences was added on. And as you can see, that the population would have been in a sorry state by the early 2000s. So the marking of the fences is probably the key thing which we've done for the conservation of Capercaillies in terms of reducing adult mortality of juvenile birds. What we've not managed to solve yet is the productivity. And as I said, these may be outside our ability to do something simple with. Crossbills. We have 3 species of crossbill. breeding in Abernethy Forest. The large-billed parrot crossbill, the small-billed common crossbill, and the Scottish crossbill, which is of an intermediate bill depth. So these all reflect the ability of these birds to break into cones. This was obviously the more powerful one, and this is the least powerful. And you can see here, this is the number of nests against time of laying of these different species. So you see the parrot crossbills nest first, then the Scottish crossbills, and the common crossbills nest last. The other thing to point out is that these birds mate like for like, so it's very rare to get a mixed Scottish and common, or a mixed parrot and Scottish. They mate like for like. So trying to explain why they nest at different times. The time, in other words, the axis along here represents as well as date, it represents the ease with which pine cones can be opened. Because these birds all specialize on taking the seeds out of the cones. So I'll try and explain that a bit more. So here's a quick rundown on the life cycle of Scots pine. So these little red things or pink things at the end there are cones just developing. A year later, these cones will look like this. They will be growing. So the tiny cones, they overwinter at a tiny stage. The following spring, they grow. So they're green and they're growing. This is through May to July. And the following year, they are fully grown and they shed their seeds. But during that stage between being green cones and fully grown by July, August, through to the following spring, that's when the cones are closed and the seeds are very difficult to get out, to remove from the cones. These are pictures of Scots pine cones which have been broken open by crossbills, the parrot crossbills, which can almost slice through the cones. I don't know if you've tried yourself, but it's even with a knife, it's actually very, very difficult to break into a cone which is closed. This picture here represents cones of different sizes that are being given to both parrot crossbills and Scottish crossbills. Now these birds were in captivity, so one could do these trials. These birds, although when they're in captivity, they like playing with cones. They don't sort of open the cones to remove the seeds, but they generally muck around with them and damage them. They just like to chew over cones. And so the amount of chewing or damage that's done to cones becomes less as the cones get bigger. In other words, these are tougher cones to deal with. And you can see clearly too, the parrot crossbills are better at damaging the cones than the Scottish crossbills. So cone size is very important in the ability of these birds to get seeds out of closed cones. So over time, as in the last picture, the cones are starting to open and become slightly easier to get into cones. So these birds here, the parrot crossbills, can deal with closed cones. But gradually, as these cones start to open, the Scottish crossbills can start to break into them. And finally, when the cones are open and the scales are all spread and the seeds are really available, this is when the common crossbills move in and breed. This picture on the left shows what the difference between Scots pine plantations and Caledonian pinewoods. See, with Scotch pine plantations, most of the cones are quite large, but in Caledonian pinewoods, especially when the trees have a large diameter at breast height, so these are the big trees, they tend to have small cones. So these cones are much more readily available to crossbills than these cones up here. So it's another reason why Caledonian pinewoods are really good for crossbills. It's to do with cone size. Crested tit. So it's another of the iconic species of the Caledonian pinewoods. The density of them is about 10 times higher than in plantations. And you think with a little bird like this, it wouldn't need requirements of big trees, but when we look at the nest sites, so these birds, they make their nests in dead Scots pines. And by looking at what's the sizes available in the old Caledonian pinewoods, these are the tree sizes here in blue. You can see the crested tits are going for trees which are bigger than is available, and about 30, 40. This is the diameter of the trunks. And then woodpeckers, they're going for even bigger trees, even up to about 150 centimeters in diameter. The reason why crested tits need big trees is that they make their nest in the sapwood. So here's a diagram of the cross section of the Scots pine. This is the heartwood here. This is the sapwood, this is the bark. So they make their nesting cavity in the sapwood between the heartwood and the bark. So there's an example, a longitudinal section. There's the eggs. So it's only when trees get bigger that they'll have a sufficient depth of sapwood in which the birds can make their nests. To give you an idea of the difference between heartwood and sapwood, you can see in this cross section of a dead tree. This stuff's all friable and loose. This is the sapwood, which rots down in about 10 years. So when this tree was cut alive, the sapwood was a live tissue, whereas the heartwood was dead. Heartwood is full of resin and is therefore almost indestructible. So that means that these standing dead trees have this pillar of rock hard heartwood which maintains these trees from falling over, whereas the sapwood is now rotting sufficiently for crested tits to dig their nest sites. Here's the woodpecker. Most of the nests found in Abernethy Forest are in dead Scots pine trees. And as I said, they require large trees so that they can excavate their nests. And there's a number of species which then make use, they're secondary users of Scots pine, of woodpecker nests. So top right, we have a honeybee. Bottom left is a swift. And here, the redstart. And there are other species as well, which are secondary nesters within woodpecker nests. It's hard to exaggerate the importance of deadwood in old forests, well, any forest really, for biodiversity. So to give an example, in Sweden, there's 4,300 beetle species, and 800 of these are dependent on deadwood. And clearly, if a deadwood stands for a long time, it has more value. So some of these trees, they may die when they're, say, a few hundred years old. They will then stand for another few hundred years. So the record from Finland is 700 years for one of these standing dead trees to remain standing. So here is a tree that I knew. I used to collect cones under it, and it died in 1999. And you can see the gradual disintegration over the following 15 years or so. It's still yet not had a woodpecker nest in it, but I reckon it's only a matter of time. One of the main aims of the RSPB is to extend the amount of Caledonian pinewoods. You know, as I said, it's a rare habitat and we'd like to have more of it. The main limiting factors has been the two deer species, both red and roe, which browsed the young trees, and that stopped the natural establishment of trees. So in time, we would like to have wood in which it looks more like this. So this is a wooded landscape which you can see in national parks in Norway, which extends from the river here, right up to a tree line here. And beyond that, there you get the scrub line. So again in Norway, you can see juniper and willows. This is around about 1,000 meters, and you get species like this, which nest rarely in Scotland, but we may have more if we have more of this. So these are the long-term aims for the reserve. And we can see that because the deer have been culled, been brought down from about 12 deer per square kilometre, this is red deer, down to about less than 5 deer per square kilometre. Trees are now beginning to establish again. So there's a photograph taken in 1975 of the upper part of Abernethy Forest. And this is a recent photograph I took, and you can see young trees are establishing where there were none in the past. So some of these trees are now coning, so it's just a matter of time that we will now get a gradual spread southward into the mountains of this amazing forest. This is the only part of Scotland where we can see Scots pine growing at a tree line. This is around 650 meters. And so the trees here are rather stunted and crooked. So they have this name Krumholtz. And in time too, we hope we can see woodland not like this develop as the trees expand into the cairngorms. That's the end of my talk, but I'd like to give a plug for the book that Robert mentioned earlier. It's an account of the forest, richly illustrated with photographs and available through the NHBS. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron. That was absolutely enthralling. And Robert will now take us off down the Q&A path.
I can't at present see the questions. Can you, Chris?
Beg your pardon?
Can you see the questions? Because I can't see questions at the moment for some reason.
Well, there's only one so far. There's only
Right.
one
That would
good question. Nobody's yet asked a question.
It was all crystal clear.
They're all done.
Can I ask a question in that case, Ron? I thought for a moment it was just me unable to see the questions coming in. I always mistrust my technological ability. But you alluded to the pine marten and the impact it's having on Capercaillie. What generally is the impact of the pine marten? I know you've done this work on crested tit nest boxes, which are not amenable to raiding by pine martens, but how big an impact are they having as they become more abundant in Abernethy?
The short answer is we don't really know. Apart from the work done with the nests of Capercaillies, which we've shown that they take a third of the nests, we haven't gone the next step to look at how they affect brood survival. It's just much so difficult on an even greater scale. Me marking chicks and so on, and so it's very difficult. So the answer is we don't know. The only thing we have is a correlation between marten abundance. Well, it's the other way around. It's the Capercaillie production and marten abundance. So comparing different woods, we have some correlation between a negative correlation indicating that woods with more Capercaillies with more pine martens tend to have poorer capra production.
Andy Richford's put in a question asking, can anything be done to discourage pine marten predation? Well, maybe you can explain a bit about your nest boxes. Because maybe we're going to need them in the rest of Britain in the near future.
I think we published the results of a study done in Caledonian Forest where for over 20 years there's been a study of the production of crested tits in nest boxes. And over the 90s, the production crashed. And there were signs that the chicks were being predated. So I set up some camera traps at nest boxes. And we now have lovely picture of martens pulling the chicks out through the nest hole. They reach into the hole and pull them out. So that was depressing the production within that nest box population. So what we did, we set an offset grid across the whole of the nest. And that stopped the martens being able to put their paws into the nests. But clearly you can't do that on to wild nests. And we know that we have seen, actually the very first sighting of a pine marten Abernethy was at a crested tit nest. And it just pulled apart the whole nest. It's very friable, this sapwood in the bark. And it's just an easy thing. The trouble is the crested tits start to become vocal close to fledging. And I think that the martens just clue into this and just help themselves. So I think we'll probably just get smaller populations of these species.
Right.
But there is an idea that we could maybe do some diversionary feeding. And that is something that's going to be trialled by a student at Aberdeen University by laying out deer carcasses and so on.
Maybe based on a couple of the questions coming in, I can ask a supplementary. What either at present or potentially in the future predates pine martens?
Yes. Let's bring back the lynx. Yeah, so we realize that it's an incomplete ecosystem we have. There's no top carnivores, no apex carnivores. There's no wolf, no lynx. And at the minute, we're effectively doing the job of the wolf and the lynx by culling deer.
Yes, the wolf and the deer, but the lynx are known elsewhere to be predators of pine martens, are they?
Yeah, they will kill the so-called mesopredators, foxes as well. That's it.
Right.
So I think they would have a tougher time if we had these apex predators.
Right. And yes, that's obviously opens up a whole can of worms about the introduction of them.
Yes, the National Farmers Union wouldn't be happy.
Another question's come in about what in Abernethy are the issues with introduced species, and things mentioned are North American mink, rhododendron, cherry laurel, and the like.
Well, there's been an eradication program for mink. In the upper parts of the Cairngorms, there's quite a big population of water voles. And they've effectively been squeezed up there because the mink don't bother to go that high. But now it used to be a lowland animal when I was a boy. And now they're restricted to these highlands. But now with the removal of mink, they've started to spread back down again. And yes, your exotic species like rhododendron, they're removed. As have the non-native conifers, Norway spruce, larches, Sitka spruce. They've all been removed largely.
Right. Okay, so it's quite good news on the introductions front. Do you actually have otter within the Abernethy Forest area?
Yes, we do.
And do they impact mink at all?
I don't know if there's an interaction.
Okay. Right. Any other questions from people? I'm trying to keep track of them. I'm not sure how good a what I'm doing. Hang on. Yeah. Okay. Someone who's asking about an interesting species you didn't really talk about was the red squirrel. Can you say much about the interaction with red squirrels and pine martens and how that plays out in a situation like Abernethy?
I've quite a poor handle on red squirrels. All we know is a bit of a handle on the interaction with crossbills, in that they take different sizes of cones.
Mm.
So red squirrels are able to get into the large cones, which are obviously more profitable with more seeds and bigger seeds. So they tend to have slightly different niches from the crossbills. And counts of squirrels show that they don't respond in the same way to the abundance of cones as the crossbills do. Crossbills can fly in and out of the forest. The cones are actually, they have an almost 3-year cycle in production. They're like the lemmings again. And when you get the peaks in cone production, you get a lot more crossbills, whereas the red squirrels, they can't really capitalize on that being less mobile.
Right.
So actually have a poor understanding of red squirrels. But I think the pine martens and other studies don't really target squirrels to the same extent. They're primarily going for field voles. All the studies
They're primarily going for what?
Pine martens is, sorry?
Primarily going for what, did you say?
Field voles.
Field voles.
Yeah.
Because clearly...
Not bank voles, which is interesting as well. So there's a study recently being done showing the differentiation between the field and the bank vole in their importance for the diet of the pine marten.
Right.
So one idea I had was that, I said that there's these old farm sites in Abernethy. These have been enriched over time, so they're more, just now they're grassland rather than heather. And of course, these are the sorts of habitats that are best for field voles.
Right.
So if we had less grassland, it might actually be poorer for pine martens and then better for...
Clearly, people, I think, are interested because of, pine martens are held as one of the solutions to grey squirrels further south, hence the interest in them in the conservation context. A couple of other questions. There's one here from Nigel Woodall. It's a comment. Alan Bantic uses a pipe on trees to stop pine martens getting to goldeneye nest boxes he's made.
Yeah.
But not something you use.
Climbing trees if they're isolated.
Right.
I think they're really interesting as time goes by, and the pine martens come into England. I think people will realise that all the little nest boxes they have are just lunch boxes for pine martens.
Well, they'll have to take your new design in that case, won't they, and replace them all. One other question. Someone is intrigued by the fact that swifts were mentioned by you. Can you say more about them in Abernethy?
Yes, we have probably a population of about maybe 15, 20 pairs, all nesting in mainly these standing dead trees with woodpecker nests that are quite high. So they're going for the higher nests, and you get little small colonies. You have 2 or 3 pairs in the one tree, and it probably represents the ancestral home. So it happens on the continent as well, in oak trees with woodpecker holes, and I think in Siberia, the swift is regarded as an old growth species.
Right. Couple of other questions here. People are certainly keen on predators, and a query about white-tailed eagles. Are eagles significant predators in Abernethy Forest on anything? On any of the tree-related species?
We have both golden and white-tailed eagles, and they're mainly feeding on hares and grouse and gulls.
Right.
In fact, the gull colony just recently been abandoned, maybe because of eagle predation, or it could be otters equally. There's an interesting thing that these big predators, they create this thing called a zone of fear. So around one of the nest sites, one of the white-tailed sites, there's now a resurgence of growth of saplings of rowans, which are highly desirable by red deer and roe deer. So the eagles effectively have created this zone of fear around this tree, allowing these trees to establish.
Right, that's very interesting indeed. Yeah, quite surprising.
Yeah, even a quite short time.
Right.
It's a bit like the snowy owls in the tundra, creating this zone of fear for foxes.
That analogy had occurred to me.
Yes, yes, successfully.
People are clearly very interested in pine martens, and can you say a little bit more about the RSPB view on pine martens and what it can do to reduce pine marten predation on key species like Capercaillie?
As I mentioned earlier, the solution seems to be around diversity feeding, if that works.
Right.
So that's going to be trialed shortly.
Right.
So that's where we're at just now with them.
It clearly a problematical situation.
Yes, yeah.
I think probably that I hopefully have covered most of the queries that have come in. So, you know, I think you've done a fantastic job, Ron, in giving us a feel for the whole of the natural history of Abernethy Forest. And I'm certainly really grateful. And I'll hand over at this point to Chris to bring the meeting to a close. Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
And may I just echo what Robert has just said. It was an enthralling talk, and starting where we started, I found it very engrossing. So thank you, Ron, very much. And thank you all for attending. Can I just reiterate that Ron has agreed for this to be recorded, and we will shortly be putting it up on YouTube. So if you've missed any part of it or have friends who weren't able to join us, then that's where it will be, and we'll put a note on the website.